All right, everybody, moving right along, we are going to talk a little bit more specifically about ecosystems and energy and the transfer of energy between levels of an ecosystem. So, an ecosystem is basically the sum of all of the organisms living within a specific area, all the biotic stuff living, and all the abiotic factors that they interact with. So thinking about the different levels up to this point, we had a population, which was a group of individuals living in a certain area. Then we had a community, which was really all of the organisms and all of the populations living in a given area. And up to that point, we were really focused just on the biotic community. So now when we're talking about an ecosystem, we're really including those abiotic things as well. So this involves the transfer of energy as well as the cycling of chemicals, thinking about those abiotic factors that exist in a given environment. Here's kind of what that looks like in a graphic point of view. So the chemical cycling oftentimes has to do with nitrogen or phosphorus or carbon. All organic things, all living things have carbon in them. So there is that transfer. And that's why a lot of the arrows have a tendency to overlap. In terms of energy, our main source of energy is the sun, which then the primary producers, plants, harvest the energy from that sun to make food. And then we then eat those things and so on. We use that energy for cellular respiration. And that's why you can see a lot of these little zigzags being given off as heat, because we need to burn a certain amount of energy to keep ourselves alive. And then there's also another set of energy that we store inside of us that could then, in theory, be transferred to other organisms that eat us. It's important to know that energy is not recycled. It's not like we can give off heat energy into the world and then magically that heat energy comes back down again. It really doesn't. We must constantly be supplied energy from the sun. That is why if there is no sun, there is no us. And if it's cloudy all the time, then life really can't exist. And that's, cycling it back to mass extinction, where if an asteroid did hit the Earth, it blacked out the sun, and therefore the plants couldn't really survive at that point. Okay, autotrophs. Autotrophs, auto means self, troph means feeding, so they are self-feeding. Those are your primary producers. They make their own food, usually because they're photosynthetic, so they use the sun to synthesize food. We often think of plants, but algae does this too. Cyanobacteria, for example. They have chloroplasts to be able to do that. Heterotrophs means other feeder. So in that case, it is something that needs to eat something else. It cannot make its own food. So these are all the different levels of consumers that exist. As I had previously mentioned, heterotrophs can exist down at many levels, anything above primary producer. So the producers are the autotrophs. They're the ones making their food. But then all herbivores and carnivores and all the other organisms that come above that are heterotrophs. Detritus is a fancy word for dead stuff. So anything that dies, all carnivores, us as humans and everything, we die eventually at a certain point. Circle of life and all. There are other organisms that then can eat dead material, dead waste, like funguses and mushrooms and things like that. Those are called detritivores, excuse me. Okay, so thinking about just putting vocab words again to these things. Herbivores that eat primary producers are called the primary consumers. And then as you move up, we have secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. You might have quaternary consumers, which is that fourth level. And then we have that super important group called detritivores, or decomposers, that eat non-living organic material, because they're the ones that are really cycling a lot of those resources. So main decomposers, again, fungus, mushrooms. For example, on this dead tree, you can see that they are thriving and they're basically breaking down that tree. A lot of prokaryotes are decomposers as well. So now we need to introduce the idea of an equation, and it has to do with energy production. So primary production is the amount of light energy that's converted to chemical energy. So that's what the producers are doing. They are harvesting light energy and converting it to chemical energy, ATP, inside the plant. And then if you look at a ecosystem as a whole, the total amount of primary production that's existing across the entire ecosystem, that is called your gross primary production. Gross in this sense meaning total or all, or GPP. So gross primary production is the total amount that is produced in an ecosystem. But keeping in mind that not all things that are produced are saved. You actually need to use some of that energy to stay alive. So that brings about the next one, NPP, or net primary production. So that's really when you take the total that is made in the first place minus all the energy that's used by that primary producer. So there's a certain amount of energy necessary to keep the plant alive. And so that comes out by doing cellular respiration. So the net gain, so to speak, is the total minus whatever it takes in terms of respiration to be used by that primary producer. So this picture just kind of shows you a couple different things. You can see that across different habitats that exist in the world, you can see where most of them exist in terms of percentage of surface area. So open ocean is a huge chunk of our Earth. And pretty much you can see that in blue are the marine habitats. So most of the Earth in terms of coverage is that. Then you can see the net production, the average primary production, and then the percentage on the right. So you can see how much is actually being produced in all of these different areas in terms of net production, and then what percentage that entails. So ocean and then tropical rainforest, you can see those make sense as the higher percentage of energy production. But thinking about, the idea that the ocean covers such a broad area, but yet it doesn't necessarily give the specific correlated percentage in net production. And that has to really do with how deep the ocean is. As you go down, photosynthesis decreases because light is just not available. So you can't really make as much anymore if you get to those lower depths. And also nutrient availability. Nitrogen and phosphorus at a certain point can play into the amount of energy production something can give. And then on land, you have to take into account temperatures and moisture availability because those things can then factor into the survival of plants. A term that we're going to get into a little bit later is called eutrophic. And if there is something like a nutrient-rich lake, meaning lots of nitrogen and phosphorus, then it can support growth of algae, which is sometimes a good thing, but in too much, like anything, it can be bad. So when you have nutrient environments where algae can grow, it is called eutrophic. Okay, so this brings about something called the 10% rule. And that's kind of just the common, quick and dirty, cut and dry energy transfer between trophic levels. If you think about all the different levels that exist in a pyramid, it's about 10% transfer in each level because only a fraction of energy is stored in our food. A lot of the energy that something takes in or eats is used right away in respiration or is lost in heat. And remembering the idea that energy flows, it's not a cycle. So it gets less and less and less and less as you move up. And you can think about this caterpillar here too. For example, it is eating plants. Let's say it takes in 200 joules worth. Well, it's doing cellular respiration, so it's going to burn some there. It has to give up feces. So there is a certain amount of food that we eat that we just have to expel. And then only 33 of that 200 is actually something that is incorporated into the caterpillar. New biomass just means that it grew or it got bigger. The amount of mass that its little life takes up. So keeping those things in mind, it's only a fraction that actually gets incorporated. And again, here this highlights that 10% rule across the trophic levels. So the sunlight has tons and tons of energy, right? But then only about 10% of that is able to be harnessed and incorporated into plants or primary producers. And then only 10% goes to herbivores, 10% goes to secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. And again, this is one of those reasons why food chains don't really go past tertiary or possibly quaternary, because those higher level consumers need to eat so much food just to get enough energy to sustain themselves. And this picture kind of highlights that too. This is a pyramid of just sheer number of organisms. And this is a pyramid of biomass, meaning how much weight. So even though there's maybe, a ton of blue grass, this is just how much available energy or how much actually it weighs collectively. So you can see that if you compare number of organisms, that's not always the easiest because it's a little bit false representing. But in the higher number of organisms, 3 versus 1.5, those are very similar. But just keeping in mind that because of that energy loss as you move up, that really limits the top level consumers. And then humans, as an example, depending on where we are different levels of consumers. So sometimes we're primary consumers and we might be lumped in with the primary consumer level. Sometimes we're secondary if we're eating a cow, for example. Sometimes we might be tertiary if we're eating tuna. Tuna eat other fish that then eat other things. So it just depends. And so depending on the food that we eat, we actually obtain way more energy when we eat plants than when we eat meat. So thinking about what trophic level we might be consuming correlates to how much energy we have. Ooh, too far. Matter, however, not energy, cycles in an ecosystem. So there are nutrients that do kind of cycle around. And you just have to be aware of some of the nutrient cycles like water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And here's just kind of an example of where some of those things go in different parts of an ecosystem or an environment. Organic materials oftentimes has to do with things that are alive or were once alive. So example, trees, energy is harvested in photosynthesis by the tree. The living organisms give off detritus when they die. They give off feces. They do respiration. Some of those inorganic materials might make their way into the water, and so on and so forth. So different elements can either give off or take in organic or inorganic materials. Here's a picture of the water cycle, just kind of showing you where those different things come in. So there might be precipitation over the ocean, meaning it's raining, clouds, water evaporates off of the ocean and goes into clouds and then might transfer over to land and then yield precipitation over land. It percolates or slowly goes through soil. There's runoff that exists in the groundwater that can then make its way back. So water has a tendency to cycle through both the air and underground in various locations. Carbon cycles too. If we think about where carbon comes in and comes out, photosynthesis, one of the key reactants in the equation of photosynthesis is carbon dioxide. So it needs to take in carbon dioxide and then gives off oxygen that then we breathe. So it's kind of fixed is a word that is often used, taken out of the environment and fixed into the plants to do photosynthesis. If you think about consumers, we give off carbon dioxide every time we breathe out. Decomposing things, we are built of carbon. So when we die and decompose, we're giving off carbon into the soil. Fossil fuels is another source of giving off carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So anything that does cellular respiration and fossil fuel burning give off CO2, whereas different elements of photosynthesis take in CO2. Nitrogen is another example. There is something called nitrogen fixation, which again means kind of taking it out of the atmosphere and incorporating it into an organism like a plant. So plants can be nitrogen fixators, and bacteria that live on the plants actually do this. There is also something called nitrification, which means that it converts ammonium in the environment to nitrite and nitrate that can then be used by the plants. It's a common element in fertilizers. And then there's also denitrification, which releases nitrogen into the air. So these pictures kind of show you where nitrogen might go in a given ecosystem. And it is a cycle. It goes from the atmosphere and then is fixed by bacteria and plants, and then gets eaten by other things and can run off and so on. It's one of those common ingredients in fertilizers. And then we also have, phosphorus. Again, I just want you to have a general idea of how these things cycle and where they come from and so on. Phosphorus gets taken up or fixed by plants as well, and then can be ingested by herbivores or decomposers. There is a cycling of phosphorus in water too. It's one of those things that water organisms need as well to survive. Algae uses it to survive as well. But it comes a lot from the rocks and the weathering of rocks. And so that's why they have sedimentation and rock weathering as part of this cycle. Okay, so restoration. One of the things as us as humans that we are destroying the earth or trying to fix, we are trying to do something called bioremediation, meaning that we as humans are trying to plant organisms or put in life forms to detoxify polluted ecosystems. So if there's a ton of carbon dioxide or other pollutants or contaminants, we might plant a whole bunch of plants to try to clean the air, for example. There's also something called bioaugmentation, which means that we specifically choose desirable species, ones that might fix nitrogen, for example, or phosphorus, to essentially bring in nutrients that the soil has lost. So if there is a lack of plants, they might bring in specific species to fix nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil that wasn't there before, in an effort to make it healthier. So whether it's the overall umbrella term of bioremediation or specifically bioaugmentation, meaning they're changing the landscape by choosing certain species, the goal is to make the area healthier. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next and last presentation.